saying Well, hello, fellow pilots. I'm John King.
And I'm Martha King.
Welcome to Practical Piloting.
In this course, we're going to give you a basket full of helpful hints, rules of thumb, tricks of the trade, all things to make your everyday flying safer and easier.
And we hope you'll find some of these rules of thumb might make in-the-head calculations a little easier.
I think that's really why flying does seem to get easier with experience. You learn these shortcuts. Things do just seem to fall into place with less effort. But now, let's get started.
Well, hello, fellow pilots. I'm John King.
And I'm Martha King.
Welcome to Practical.
We're going to give you a basket full of helpful hints, rules of thumb, tricks of the trade, all things to make your everyday flying safer and easier.
And we hope you'll find some of these rules of thumb might make in-the-head calculations a little easier.
I think that's really why flying does seem to get easier with experience. You learn these shortcuts. Things do just seem to fall into place with less effort. But now, let's get started. And to do that, John's going to lead off with a hint on how to make your airplane fly faster.
Let's talk about some rules of thumb. You know, having rules of thumb handy will reduce the time needed to make calculations in flight planning, but maybe more important, knowing these rules of thumb is going to make your workload a lot less if changes are required while you're in flight. So that's going to be a big help. Besides that, they make great material for hangar flying conversations. Enough of this nonsense. Let's you and I go to work, and let's talk about the first rule of thumb. And that is, let's assume that you're planning a cross-country trip in your own airplane. Well, hello, fellow pilots. I'm John King.
And I'm Martha King.
Welcome to Practical Piloting.
In this course, we're going to give you a basket full of helpful hints, rules of thumb, tricks of the trade, all things to make your everyday flying safer and easier.
And we hope you'll find some of these rules of thumb might make in-the-head calculations a little easier.
I think that's really why flying does seem to get easier with experience. You learn these shortcuts. Things do just seem to fall into place with less effort. But now, let's get started. And to do that, John's going to lead off with a hint on how to make your airplane fly faster.
Let's talk about some rules of thumb. You know, having rules of thumb handy will reduce the time needed to make calculations in flight planning, but maybe more important, knowing these rules of thumb is going to make your workload a lot less if changes are required while you're in flight. So that's going to be a big help. Besides that, they make great material for hangar flying conversations. Enough of this nonsense. Let's you and I go to work, and let's talk about the first rule of thumb. And that is, let's assume that you're planning a cross-country trip in your own airplane, and you would like to make sure that your airplane is as fast as you can make it go while using the least fuel. How could you do that? Sounds like a great idea to me. That's what everyone wants. Well, here's one way to do it, and that is you load the airplane with the center of gravity near the aft CG limit. Now, you still want to stay forward of the aft CG limit, but if you load the center of gravity near the aft CG limit, you're going to find the airplane is faster than it would be otherwise. Let's talk about why. And to do that, let's take a look at a picture of an airplane. First of all, you need to know that most little airplanes, and almost all airplanes, in fact, are designed so that the center of gravity is in front of this line we're calling the center of lift. Now, the FAA calls that the center of pressure, but we're going to call it the center of lift. Now, if the center of gravity is in front of the center of lift, if you pick this airplane up by a string at the center of lift, what's going to happen? It's going to nose down. Well, to keep it from nosing down, almost all airplanes have an aerodynamic downforce designed into the tail. In other words, the tail isn't trying to fly up, it's actually trying to fly down. And that aerodynamic downforce in the tail keeps the airplane from nosing down. Now, the reason the airplane is designed so that it has an aerodynamic downforce in the tail is that downforce helps make the airplane stable as far as pitch and speed are concerned. Here's why. Let's assume you're flying along, and for some reason the airplane gets a little too fast. Well, if the airplane gets too fast, there's going to be more air over this tail, and there'll be more downforce in the tail. Well, when the airplane's too fast, that's going to make the tail go down, the nose will go up, the airplane will climb, reduce speed, and return to its original speed. That helps make the airplane stable. Now, if an airplane for some reason starts to get too slow, there's less downforce in the tail, the airplane will pitch down and descend and pick up speed and return to its original speed. So that aerodynamic downforce on the tail is actually designed in the airplane. It helps make the airplane stable as far as pitch and speed are concerned. But you pay a penalty for it, because now the tail's trying to fly down, the wings are trying to fly up, and they're fighting each other. And so what happens is, because there's an aerodynamic downforce in the tail, the airplane is more stable, but it's less efficient, and it is slower. So if you move the center of gravity further aft, you can change where the center of gravity is in regard to the center of lift. You can put bricks in your baggage compartment if you want to do that. Okay, now, if you move the center of gravity further aft, there's less aerodynamic downforce in the tail. The airplane is less stable, but it's also more efficient. It'll fly faster and require less fuel. If you move the center of gravity forward, then of course the airplane becomes more stable, but it'll fly slower and require more fuel. So you see there's a trade-off between the CG location and the amount of fuel required and the speed of the airplane. So if you feel like you want to, by all means, have maximum speed in your airplane, what you want to do is load the center of gravity rearward. The airplane will become less stable, but more efficient and a little faster. Of course, you would never want to get after the rear CG limit, because then the airplane can become negatively stable. Stall recovery could become difficult or probably impossible. So, for faster speed, load the CG more rearward. Here's another rule of thumb, and it's about the fuel that you're burning when you're flying in an airplane. As a rule of thumb, you'll find that a reciprocating engine airplane will burn approximately a half a pound of fuel per horsepower per hour. Now, there's 6 pounds per gallon, so you can use that to figure that out. Now, let's make some sense out of this. Let's assume that you have a friend, and I mean a really good friend, and he's got a P-51 Mustang, fantastic airplane, World War II fighter, 400 mile an hour, 1,200 horsepower, P-51 Mustang, and he says that he's going to give you a ride in that airplane, and all you have to do is pay for the fuel. Now the question is, how much fuel are you going to have to buy? Well, now remember, it's a 1,200 horsepower engine, and let's assume that we're going to fly around at 75% power instead of 100% power. After all, you are buying the fuel. So we're going to, on the average, use, we'll say, 900 horsepower. Well, the rule is 900 horsepower times a half pound per hour, so you should be using 450 pounds per hour. And 450 pounds per hour divided by that 6 pounds per gallon I mentioned earlier means that you're going to have to use 75 gallons an hour to get this ride in this P-51 Mustang. Well, you say that doesn't compute. I can't even imagine a figure like 75 gallons an hour. Well, let's do the same thing for your mighty C-150, otherwise known as a Cessna 150. All right, let's take a look at it. 100 horsepower, roughly, in a Cessna 150 times 65%, 65 horsepower on the average. We're going to assume that you're not going to fly your Cessna 150 at full bore all the time either. This time we're going to use 65%. So 65 horsepower times a half pound per horsepower per hour means you're going to be burning 32.5 pounds per hour. 6 pounds per gallon means about 5.4 gallons an hour. See, it works for a Cessna 150 as well as it does with a P-51 Mustang. So the rule of thumb to remember is about a half pound per horsepower per hour. Now notice that it actually varies, because if you have a point where the engine is most efficient, then if you increase the horsepower out of the engine, it gets a little less efficient. And if you decrease from that point the horsepower that you're putting out of the engine, it gets a little less efficient also. But the rule is that it hovers around about a half pound of fuel per horsepower per hour. Now, let's take a look at another rule of thumb, and that is, let's assume that you want to increase the speed of your airplane. As you're flying along, you'd like to know, what's the trade-off? How much more fuel am I using because I increase the speed of the airplane? Well, here's the trade-off. An increase in power setting causes the fuel flow to increase more than twice as much as the airspeed. In other words, it takes twice as much fuel to go fast. Let's take a look at it. Compared to 75% power at 65% power. Let's assume you've been flying along at 65% power. As a rule of thumb, when you increase your fuel flow, you're going to increase it from 65% to 75% by 14%. So you're going to have a 14% increase in fuel flow, but you're only going to have a 6% increase in your airspeed. So the rule of thumb is it costs more than twice as much to go fast, and going fast is very expensive in an airplane. Let's slow down a little bit and see what the effect is when we slow down. Yeah, well, we slow down. Let's assume we've been at 75% power and we slow down to 55% power. Well, when you do that, your fuel flow is going to decrease this time by 25%. But your airspeed will only decrease by 12%. Once again, you save, if you want to think about it the other way around, you save twice the fuel by slowing down half the amount. Now, all of us have landed in a crosswind, and we realize that there's a crosswind component chart. You can figure out the crosswind component when you're landing in a crosswind. But a lot of us don't have that crosswind component chart handy in the airplane, and besides that, you have to hunt for it and whip it out. So here's a handy rule of thumb. If the wind is 30 degrees off the runway heading, then the crosswind component is 1/2 the wind velocity. Let's take a look at that crosswind chart and see if we can make some sense out of this. Here you are with a wind 30 degrees off the nose. So you start out at the 30-degree line and run in towards the lower left-hand corner of the chart until you hit, for instance, a 40-knot wind strength arc. These arcs are the wind strength, and we'll stop at the 40-knot arc, saying we have a 40-knot wind. Then you read right straight down from that arc, and you read your crosswind component, and we had a 20-knot crosswind component. So a good rule of thumb is, if the wind is 30 degrees off the nose, then you just take half of the wind strength and call it your crosswind component. If the wind is 45 degrees off the nose, then you would say that about 3/4 of the wind is your crosswind component. For instance, we have a 40-knot wind. Here we said about 28. And finally, if you have a wind 60 degrees or more off the nose, you just might as well use the entire wind as your crosswind component. So let's take a look at that rule of thumb one more time. And the rule of thumb is, if the wind is 30 degrees off the nose, use half the wind as your crosswind component. 45 degrees off the nose, use 3/4 of the wind. And 60 degrees off the nose, just use the entire wind as your crosswind component. Now, another rule of thumb we want to talk about is the speed for hydroplaning on an airplane. Incidentally, you might be interested to know there's actually 3 types of hydroplaning. One type of hydroplaning is called viscous hydroplaning, and it's caused by the jelly-like properties of the water keep generally the nose wheel from making contact with the runway. It occurs at very slow speeds, little teeny tiny film of water, about 1,000th of an inch of water, and that's called viscous hydroplaning. It occurs at slow speeds. It's typically a problem in getting traction to make the turn off the runway after landing. It's called viscous hydroplaning. Another kind of hydroplaning I like to call idiot hydroplaning because it's called reverted rubber hydroplaning. And this requires that you land and lock the wheels of the aircraft. And what happens is, actually you melt the tires, rubber accumulates underneath the tires, little beads of reverted rubber. That's rubber that's melted and reverted back to its gummy-like state. And you actually hydroplane on steam that's caught in little pockets of reverted rubber, and that's called reverted rubber hydroplaning. It requires you to lock the wheels of the aircraft. But the type of hydroplaning that most of us are familiar with is called dynamic hydroplaning. And that occurs when the airplane water skis on the water. And that's the one that's most common and the one we're talking about here. Now, the rule of thumb is that you can figure out the speed at which your airplane will begin dynamic hydroplaning. Dynamic hydroplaning requires a relatively thick film of water, not a little tiny film, but almost standing water. So let's assume you're landing in standing water. The question is the airplane going to hydroplane? Well, it depends on the tire pressure of the airplane. And the rule of thumb is dynamic hydroplaning begins at a speed which is 9 times the square root of the tire pressure. For instance, let's assume you're flying a light single-engine airplane with a tire pressure of 36 psi, 36 pounds per square inch. Well, the square root of 36 is 6. So this airplane, you multiply it times 9, and this airplane, you'll notice, will begin hydroplaning at around 54 knots. And that's a good rule of thumb. If you're flying something like a Cessna 172, you'll find that it's going to hydroplane somewhere in the vicinity of 50 knots. Now, another thing I should tell you is if you land and have the wheels locked, the airplane will actually hydroplane for dynamic hydroplaning a little slower speed than 9 times. You might use a number of 7 or some slower speed. Now, let's assume today you're flying your Cessna Citation instead of a Cessna 172. It has a tire pressure of about 100 pounds per square inch. Well, the square root of 100 is 10, so a Cessna Citation will hydroplane for dynamic hydroplaning about 9 times that, or about 90 knots. Now, let's assume today you're flying up in the bush in Alaska, and you're flying a Super Cub with Tundra tires. These huge balloon-like tires, and they have a pressure of 4 psi. What's it going to hydroplane at? Well, take a 4 psi, square root of that is 2, 9 times 2, and you're going to find that this Super Cub with Tundra tires will hydroplane at about 18 knots. So hydroplaning becomes a problem for airplanes with low tire pressure, not high tire pressure, because low tire pressure, you have a tendency for the hydroplaning speed to be slower than the landing speed of the airplane. You can figure out the dynamic hydroplaning speed for your airplane using this rule of thumb. Now, let's figure out approximate density altitude as a quick rule of thumb, and it's an easy one. To approximate your density altitude, add 1,000 feet to the field elevation for each 8 degrees centigrade above standard temperature, or they call that Celsius now, 8 degrees Celsius above standard temperature. Well, the first thing we need to know, of course, is how to figure out the standard temperature. So let's you and I see if we can't figure out the standard temperature. Well, the first thing you need to know to do that is that you have to know the standard temperature at sea level. And that's a case of memorizing it. The standard temperature at sea level is 15 degrees Celsius. Now, another thing you need to know is the temperature decreases 2 degrees Celsius for each 1,000 feet you go up. Now that we've got that rule of thumb, let's assume you and I are going on a trip. And let's leave from Bryce Canyon, Utah. So let's take a look at Bryce Canyon, Utah, and they're at an elevation of 7,586 feet. We'll call it roughly 7,500 feet, 7,586, something like that. Now let's go back to our rule of thumb. And we said earlier that the standard temperature at sea level is 15 degrees Celsius, and the temperature cools down 2 degrees Celsius for each 1,000 feet you go up. So at 7,500 feet of altitude, which is roughly the Bryce Canyon elevation, the standard temperature starts out, cools off 2 degrees for each 1,000 feet you go up, so it's going to cool down 15 degrees Celsius. Well, it started out at 15 degrees Celsius, cools down 15 degrees Celsius. So at Bryce Canyon, on a standard day, what should the temperature be in Celsius? And the answer is 0. Should be right at the freezing level. Now let's take a look at what we're going to do with that information. Well, let's assume today at Bryce Canyon, instead of being freezing or 0 degrees Celsius, let's assume today the temperature is just a little bit warmer than that. Let's assume today the temperature is 24 degrees Celsius. Now the question we're asking is, what effect does this non-standard temperature warmer temperature going to have on our density altitude? Well, let's take a look at it. The temperature, instead of being 0 degrees Celsius, is 24 degrees Celsius. That means the temperature is 24 degrees Celsius warmer than standard. And by the way, if you ever wonder where you're going to get Celsius temperatures, because you know that flight service stations and control towers give you temperature and dew point in Fahrenheit, well, you get this temperature by looking at the outside air temperature gauge on the airplane, because there is a little ring for Celsius temperatures. And we use Celsius temperatures because this rule of thumb works. And here's the rule of thumb. To approximate density altitude, add 1,000 feet to the field elevation for each 8 you're going to find out that's the maximum altitude at which you can still get 75%.